This is Crystal Jordan, your host for Sisters with Superpowers, our monthly book club meeting. And I'm excited to be here with you guys. As always, every month we have an amazing author to author conversation with a woman of color author and myself. Now, if you're asking why am I the host, I am an author, a third time author. My third book, Dear Alpha Female, which you see the artwork back there, was released February 2023 and is doing really well. The book really addresses career women. We know that there are so many things happening with African American women in today's landscape, especially when it comes to career and leadership. That was my way of addressing some of the issues that some of us leaders deal with in life when it comes to relationships specifically. But most importantly, I enjoy talking to authors because I grew up a kid that could not keep her head out of a book. I was always at the library, later on at the bookstore. I actually worked as community relations manager for Barnes and Noble and had the advantage of coordinating book signings and author appearances at the store in the Southeast region. So my life has really been made up of conversations and experiences and activations with authors. And so I think they're some of the most amazing people to talk to because literature is a way that we're able to learn our history and, learn our history from a vantage point that includes culture. And so today's guest, I thought was very timely for the conversation that's happening in pop culture. We know that everyone is obsessed with the royals right now. Headlines hit again a couple of days ago about Meghan Markle and this whole scandal. And of course, we know that there's just a fascination from the very beginning. I was able to visit Disney earlier this week, and I had an opportunity to see Creative Soul has a collection of Disney princesses that are of color. If you guys see that right now, that is the Cinderella version of the Princess of Color. Creative Soul has an entire collection, which is amazing because we saw The Little Mermaid and we see that women of color are now being included in some of these stories. We know we were always a part of them. However, we see that that's being acknowledged and it's being shared on a larger scale. So today's author is the author of a book that serves that same vein. It is all about fantasy, all about romanticism, and also has a very strong history tie as well. Denny S. Bryce is the award-winning author of historical fiction novels Wild Women and the Blues, In the Face of Sun, and the upcoming The Other Princess, a novel of Queen Victoria's goddaughter based on the life of Sarah Forbes Bonetta. A former professional dancer and public relations professional, Denny is an adjunct professor in the MFA program at Drexel University, a book critic for NPR, and a freelance writer whose work has been published in USA Today, Harper's Bazaar, and Frolic Media. She is a member of the Historical Novel Society, Women's Fiction Writers Association, and Tall Poppy Writers. Originally from Chicago, she now resides in Savannah, Georgia, and can be found online at Denny S. Bryce. Please help me welcome the amazing Denny S. Bryce. Welcome.
Wow, thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. This is a very exciting moment for me. This is the very first interview I have had on my book, The Other Princess, a novel of Queen Victoria's goddaughter, that will be coming out October 3rd, 2023. So it's available for pre-order now, but the book won't be out for a few more months. But I am thrilled to be able to talk about it with you.
Well, I'm excited to have you here. As I mentioned to you when I reached out after meeting you at Black Writers Weekend almost a year ago.
I know.
I thought, what an amazing, very timely subject right now.
Mm-hmm.
I am one of the people that are totally obsessed with Queen Charlotte, the Netflix series from Shonda Rhimes. And I think, it's interesting to see that so many other people are still fascinated with it as well. We know that people enjoy the hearing and reading about the royals. And I think that idea kind of transcends color and culture. I think people just enjoy reading about something that seems very esteemed and maybe a little bit removed from where they are. What was your inspiration and how did you go from, because I'm a big fan of what your previous book, Wild Women in the Blues. I got a copy of that last year, read it, and enjoyed that very much. Very different, very different
Yeah.
main character. That
Yes.
was not a princess. She definitely was a woman
She
of
thought she
something.
was at times. But, yeah, no. The origin of this book is interesting. First and foremost, this is what is called biographical historical fiction. Sarah Forbes Bonetta existed.
Mm-hmm.
She was Queen Victoria's goddaughter. Her story is documented in newspaper articles, dissertations by professors and historians. And I even put my eyes on her words that she wrote in letters to Queen Victoria, to other people in the castle, etc., as she grew older.
Mm-hmm.
And we even have her origin story to a certain extent. So, but the story actually came to me through the editor who posted on Twitter, how come nobody's written a story about this woman, Sarah Forbes Bonetta? And
Mm-hmm.
that's Tessa Woodward over at HarperCollins. And of course, seeing that tweet and then having a good friend cueing me in on the fact that they were looking for this book, I put my hat in the ring, so to speak. And next thing you know, after some writing and hard work and nerves and what have you that goes with this profession,
Mm-hmm.
um, I had a deal. I had a contract, and I was away and I was writing away.
Mm-hmm.
What I found when I had seen a little bit about this woman when she was a young girl in the TV series. Oh gosh, Victoria. One of the, a few years ago, there were a couple of Victoria-esque movies, and so she was portrayed. Um, but her roots are in West Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Her family was part of a situation with a warring tribe, and
Mm-hmm.
they were defeated in battle and taken into enslavement by
Mm-hmm.
the other African tribe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that is some of the other documentation. The commander, his name was Lieutenant Commander Forbes,
Mm-hmm.
who was a British soldier, of course, but also tasked with going to Africa and trying to communicate to the different African kings about the fact that slavery was no longer a part. Well, he had tried to convince them that
Mm-hmm.
slavery was no longer a part of how the products, uh,
Okay.
quote, they could sell.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a rich background in that area that I was able to get my hands on, get my eyes on, and sort of infuse that portion of this in this story of this woman's amazing life.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit before we get into that, because I think it's fascinating when I read, about her story and how she was almost gifted to the queen.
Yes.
That's interesting. But before we go there, I always have felt that biographical and historical fiction, as you know, because you see things that you're able to pull during your research, but then you're able to add. Tell us the process of being able to add a personality and almost breathe life into those pages, those documents and dates and pieces of information. How are you able to create a full personality,
Mm.
with likes, dislikes, a perspective, and just add flesh to that? Because a lot of times when you're reading history, a lot of us read it from a very, these are statistics, this is information, but being able to take that information and to create a persona with it has got to take some skill. So what's your process for translating the information that you learned into a Victoria that you can relate to? Yeah.
Yeah. It's I'd say that most, if not all, historical fiction authors um, rely heavily on the word fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we take our history and make sure we have those key unchangeable things, those benchmarks throughout history that
Mhm.
we put in place. And
Mhm.
then part of studying history, because this story is a young girl who was born in West Africa and who spent a lot of time in London, in the royal houses, in Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, and throughout that life, but also spent a lot of time in Sierra Leone,
Mhm.
spent a lot of time in Freetown. So thinking of, I had to do research on what was happening in that part of the world that she was living in during that time. How were women treated? How were women of color, Black women, Negroes treated, looked upon? How
Mhm.
was the aristocracy? Were there other Blacks in the aristocracy of London that she could have interacted with? What was the Queen Victoria's attitude toward people like Mary Seacole, who
Mhm.
was the Florence Nightingale, the Black Florence Nightingale, but they were in London at the same time. But the royal house may not have liked one, but turned their attention to another. Who
Mhm.
would someone like Sarah Forbes Bonetta be interested in learning more about or following? So you take the facts, and then part of your job is to create a character that has a personality, that has fears, that has flaws, that
Mhm.
has goals, that has um, gumption, courage, weaknesses,
Mhm.
all of that stuff that people have, that makes that character more accessible to the reader. And
Mhm.
that's what our goal is, that we want the reader turning the page, even though they could look up a lot of facts
Mhm.
on Wikipedia, for example, about anybody
Mhm.
that falls under the umbrella of biographical historical figure.
Mhm.
Then to discover through the author's research and frankly, their skill at taking character, at taking facts and turning that into character,
Mhm.
and getting really excited about that. I'm very excited about that opportunity to
Mhm.
decipher facts. I guess it's part of my journalism background. Um,
Mhm.
you know, except you're supposed to always say nothing but the truth in journalism.
Or legend, or preface it with the legend, right? So let's talk about that, because that is one of the things that I think, I mentioned, Disney has a
Mhm.
series by Creative Soul that is absolutely beautiful, and I love that that is available. But we're aware that during certain periods, the attitude towards women of color was very different. So can you talk a little bit about what was happening during that time period, and how
Oh,
was she received?
well, the story begins in 1840s, and goes for many years, all the way into 1901. Frankly, um, the attitude in Britain was racism, prejudice, all of that existed.
Mhm.
Um, Britain, London at that time was very much a class-driven society. You
Mhm.
had you had royalty, you
Mhm.
had aristocrats, and you had the very poor.
Mhm.
And so there, I believe I was just reading. I'm also working on another story that will potentially take place during that time period. And one of the other things that were a part of society was that the only people who could vote were aristocracy.
Mm.
And thinking about that, oh my goodness. Now, um, Black women or African queens and kings and all of that, they existed in society as visitors
Mhm.
on occasion to the royal household.
Mhm.
But there was also wealthy Africans, very wealthy Africans that were a part of British society. Um,
Okay.
a lot of what was happening in Sierra Leone, for example, or the there's so many different places. Some of the other spots in Africa were where the African community emulated British aristocracy society because they
Oh, wow.
there's that kind of wealth.
Mm-hmm.
So, but there was still, nonetheless, um, people were like, "What is this?" There were only a few
Okay.
Africans in the royal household, and I
Mhm.
keep emphasizing Africans because in America, during a lot of what was going on in London, Americans were enslaving, um, and it was the early days prior to the Civil War.
Mhm.
In 1834, Britain ended slavery as something that people could do,
Okay.
but they did not emancipate slaves.
Mm.
So there was still a situation where people who had been slaves or enslaved were still enslaved, but
Right.
they couldn't,
They
so
were
it was very
right.
complex. It was a very complex society. So not that much different, for the short answer,
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
that there wasn't that much difference for a Black woman. Sarah Forbes Bonetta, for example, did have, eyes on her when there's a news article that I reference in the story where she's invited to the royal wedding, and it's a news story because
'Cause she.
this Black girl has been invited by the Queen to her daughter's wedding.
Mhm. Wow.
And, the whole, I mean, 2 pages
Oh,
of
wow. It was that much of a shocker. It was newsworthy. Okay.
newsworthy that this was happening. Her
Mm.
entire life, for a certain portion of it, was news because
Wow.
anytime she was in the castle.
Sounds not too far off from what's happening today with Meghan Markle and
Yeah.
and that and the fact that that was news and that she constantly had eyes on her. One of the things I wonder, because with her being like I said, people have went crazy with this Netflix series called Queen Charlotte, and there are small similarities there in the fact that Charlotte came from German
Mhm.
descent and had a certain I guess pedigree,
Right.
and was that's why she was able to be potentially wed to the king. For Sarah, with her coming and being an African princess, what was her title? Did it I guess did it transfer to
Well,
British royalty?
interestingly enough, no, not necessarily. I would not say her title transferred, but as colonial worlds do, they renamed her.
Okay.
And her original name was Anya, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Aina.
Mm-hmm.
Her name, Sarah, which was you know,
Yeah.
they named her Sarah,
Mm-hmm.
means princess. Um, its meaning for that. So interesting that they did, whether it was deliberate or accidental, I can't say, but
Right.
they did choose a name for her. What I felt strongly about in telling her story was that she was born a princess
Mm-hmm.
in her town.
Mm-hmm.
Her father was the man in charge. He was recognized as a king, as was her family.
Mm-hmm.
So her upbringing from the youngest, from birth, was that of a girl, of
Of
a
royalty.
person of royalty. She was special. And
Mm-hmm.
so to me, from some of the letters I read that she wrote later in life, I always felt that she never lost that.
Mm-hmm.
She
Mm-hmm.
she never lost it, no matter what she had to face. And there were some things she had to face that were, you know, frightening,
Right.
scary, wonderful, absolutely aggravating.
Mm-hmm.
But she had a something inside her that just screamed resilience and pride. She had a
Mm-hmm.
lot of self-pride.
Mm-hmm. I love that because that's something that we see, um, even when you think about the warrior king, right? And the way that the women in the tribes in the warrior tribes, who eventually was made royalty because of her strength and her dedication to and commitment. That's a consistent theme that we see, with Black women specifically: resiliency, right? And I also would say a sense of pride, in a
Mm-hmm.
way of, there's a different sense of pride in how one presents oneself, even in the face of adversity, right? Um,
Exactly.
and so I would love to delve a little bit deeper into that part of it, because when we see the other princess, and we know that there's this idea of her being, being placed in a position where she was bestowed adoration upon her at some point, she also had a very different experience than some other princess. So can we talk a little bit about some of the things that she saw, some of the things that she had to bear witness to, that definitely did not happen on the other side of the spectrum with royalty?
Well, for example, not to give away too much, not to give away too many spoilers, but her family um, was, I guess it's since she was adopted as a goddaughter, it's not a mystery that her family must have been killed.
Mhm,
That was something she witnessed. Um, and she also, um, long journeys, very long journeys, from one place to the other, where she had to learn languages. She happened to be one of those people who could really learn languages fast.
mhm, mhm,
And she spent time as a translator. She would translate the Bible into, or support some of the ministers who had this task of translating the Bible, King James Bible,
mhm,
into different African or Yoruba um, languages or dialects or what have you. So she had a proficiency that she used that was important for her to, um, I don't want to say take advantage of, but she recognized what she believed was
mhm,
her value at different stages of her life, to
mhm,
accomplish her value to others so she could accomplish what she wanted.
mhm, mhm,
Um, when you were asking the question, I thought about Meghan Markle because of in those early days when it was all the news and oh my God, she's dating him. Oh
yeah,
my God, they're really dating. Oh
mhm,
my God, this, that, and the other. Her public persona has always been consistent.
mhm,
Always, I mean, she let the curtain down in the Oprah interview and a couple of other interviews very, very later in the process.
mhm,
I think inherently there was a stature that she maintained
mhm.
in order to take the hits.
Right, that's a
Know,
good point.
frankly, um,
Mhm,
you the the thing that I also feel, besides just blatant British press racism, is that, and yes, I said it,
mhm,
that aggravates them so, is
mhm,
that they can't um, get her to act a fool.
mhm. They
Okay,
can't get a reaction out of her.
get it. And they're sitting there just like, oh, you
Mhm,
know, what can
mhm,
we do? What can we figure out?
mhm,
And I don't know if I can't say again. I don't want to dig deeply into spoilers, but um, this character that I drew from the facts of her life
mhm,
really like her,
mhm,
and
mhm.
I liked her from page one,
Okay.
um, and that was made it an enjoyable process to
Mhm.
write her story.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, because I love, I've always loved learning about about characters. And I remember growing up as a young girl and loving Marilyn Monroe. And then I learned that there was a Dorothy Dandridge, and I became fascinated, you know what I mean? Because I didn't see that, but I got exactly what I was loving in Marilyn Monroe from Dorothy Dandridge. And I think that even like we talked about earlier before we started this formal conversation, you know, there's this idea of Black women being business owners and being such great leaders, and then we read about Madam CJ Walker and so many other women back, you know, in the day, that there's this history there. And it kind of, I think for women of color, it reminds you that you are all you've always been who you are, right? There's always been this resilience there, as we talked about. What do you think the message is, the underlying message is with Sarah's story? As you got a chance to get to know her even more doing the research, what do you think that the message is for readers that will get a chance to pick up this book and get to know her? A story that we haven't, you know, really heard much about up until now.
Oh my. I think now that's, as the author, I might say that that's sort of hard for me to answer, because I see her as growing and changing. So
Mhm,
she starts with a certain sense of whimsy, and she's when the character opens, when the story opens, well, not the opening prologue, but when the book actually opens, she's like 5 or 6 years old. She's a
mhm,
kid,
mhm,
and and the voice narrating the story, which is her, is is um, is is looking at her in that moment. Who was she in that moment? She was a little girl who was treated very special by
mhm,
her family,
mhm,
and something happens that changes what she thinks is the um, the way the world is. And I
mhm,
think that if we talk about the big picture arc, that might be the whole thing in a nutshell. She's
mhm,
always having to see a new world and
mhm,
live in it.
mhm, mhm,
It's constant. And um, you either deal with it or you don't thrive.
mhm,
And so, how can you, even if you make mistakes, even if you make dangerous mistakes,
mhm,
um, which she does, um, can you keep going?
mhm,
Can you figure out a way, even as a young person, because, youth is another factor that I incorporated into the story very much, because um, um, to me, in the inspired fictional story, she and Princess Alice were very close. They're
mhm,
the same age, respectively, so even though age is an issue in the story. Um, but she and Princess Alice have a connection
mhm,
that still doesn't whitewash um, the situation uh,
mhm, mhm,
between them. It's still um, in the midst of, she is always a
mhm,
Negro.
mhm,
She doesn't back away from who she is.
mhm,
And that is important, I think. I think that is, again, resilience. But at the same time, there are so many stories. You mentioned, and I can't recall if we were talking about this before we went live, but how many stories there are to be told
mhm,
about women of color, about African American women, about African women, about Black women, wherever their roots are. These stories have been out here for a long, long, long time. They've been ready for the
mhm,
picking, if you
mhm,
will. And what is happening is that the opportunity to tell these stories is expanding.
mhm,
You always had any way you wanted to tell a story, you put that story together and you get it out there. That
mhm.
you did that.
Right.
But as an author, you had to write what you had to write when you had to write it.
Mhm,
But now there's that added opening in publishing,
mhm,
in indie publishing, in traditional publishing, where Black stories are, yes, yes, I want to read that. And
mhm,
and it's so important right now with some of the things that are happening in this country, where Black history is being under attack by certain areas of the world.
mhm,
So um, and of this country.
Yeah.
So being able to tell these stories, one thing I'm noticing that I'm very excited about is how many how many young Black women and men on TikTok are just pulling up the history. You
Mhm.
know, they're looking. There's like, hey, I got a following now, so let me dig into this old book that I wasn't paying attention to. And, you know, so there's more stories coming, is what I'm
Mhm.
really saying. And these books, whether they're biographical historical fiction, just or fictional characters thrown in with historical characters,
Mhm.
whatever the story is, it's valid, it's
Right.
storytelling, it's
Right.
readable. Last weekend, I was in Atlanta for the Go On Girl um, annual awards conference
Mhm.
or get together. I was very excited that in 2021 I was selected. The Wild Women in the Blues was the debut novel, and I was the debut author of the year. And so I went back to hang out with 200 or 300 Black women readers, and one of the topics for a panel discussion was reading as as now the word has totally dropped my but it as not resistance but as activism. It was reading as activism, and what a timely topic. And
Mhm.
it was beautifully moderated, and it was just so exciting. But I'm doing a lot of book clubs,
Mhm.
or and it can be an all white book club, it can be an all Black book club, it can be mixed, it doesn't matter. People are out there wanting to dive into these stories and hear about and question, how did you get to this? And I'm sitting there, okay. And, sometimes I get a little nervous because readers dig differently than,
Yeah.
yeah, and I'm sitting there like, I didn't think of that. Okay.
But that's
Oh,
the beauty. That's the beauty of a book. I think
right, your experience
you
too.
get a chance to apply your own perspective and to everything, which makes it even bigger sometimes.
Mhm,
But I want to ask you, because with biographical fiction, I've written my first novel was, I was able to tell a story that was important to me, but there weren't boundaries on it because it was fiction,
mhm,
right? So
mhm,
when you deal with historical, especially specifically biographical fiction that has an importance to the culture, an importance to our heritage, how do you how do you draw the line between your the voices that you hear with the character and the reality? I know that there was some discrepancies in one of the shows that was on Netflix. I believe it was the Madam CJ Walker story, and a lot of the writers made a decision to fictionalize certain parts of her life
mhm.
that were not necessarily aligned with the history. But we know that stories are, we have to entertain, and you need certain pieces in a story to come together to keep the reader connected. So how do you find that balance? Because like I said, I really enjoyed your first book, and in that book there were a lot of things that happened that you knew were happening during that time period that were true, right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
how do you find the balance of being able to go ahead and lean in a fiction in an area, and then at other times be very strict and stick to the actual.
Well, I I think when as I said, there are benchmarks that you can't necessarily change. If I'm going to mention the Crimean War in the other princess novel, it has to take place during the days it took place.
Right.
But the conversation that I write about a debate that Princess Alice and Sarah Forbes Bonetta might have about Florence Nightingale versus someone else versus Mary Seacole, that is based on me pulling together the facts that there was conflict in Britain
Mhm.
about Mary Seacole versus Florence Nightingale. And I made a decision that my main character was going to be on Mary Seacole's side because she's brown.
Right. Right.
You know, no other,
Figure
she's
that
brown.
right.
That's where I'm going to plant my stake.
Right.
So it's fiction, and that is what um, you have license as a fiction writer. I feel that you might come across another Sarah Forbes Bonetta story that goes way far
Mm-hmm.
into fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll tell you, as authors, they'll tell you that, this is half fantasy, or this is blah, 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 or I was inspired by
Right. Right.
this true story.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Marilyn Monroe, and now I'm going to talk about real fast. Um, I have a co-author, Eliza Knight, and I
Mm-hmm.
wrote a book that's coming out in early 2024 called Lady Ella and Norma Jean.
Oh,
Um,
nice. That
and
friendship.
it's
Yes.
and it is about the friendship between Ella Fitzgerald and Marilyn Monroe.
Oh,
And we researched the life out of that, and we're very excited about our fictionalized version
yes.
because we weren't there,
Yes.
we weren't sitting in the room,
Mm-hmm.
but it was an amazing journey of research for both of us because Ella Fitzgerald has not been fictionalized, I don't think, anywhere, and maybe one or two books as a minor
A
uh,
minor character in different things.
character,
Mhm.
but she's the main character here.
I
And
love.
Marilyn Monroe, um, I won't go into it again, spoilers, but we made a decision about who we thought she was
Mhm. Mhm.
versus what 60 years later, what
Right. Right.
her iconic aura tells you she was.
Right.
So I'm looking forward to talking about that book in a few months.
Well, I'm looking forward to talking to you about it because, like, obviously, I said I was a huge fan growing up. Also,
Yeah.
a fan of Ella Fitzgerald, and I became aware of that friendship a few years ago. And there are some
Mhm.
quotes that both Marilyn made and Ella Fitzgerald made that are, very telling. Also, was interesting to me because I probably was a Marilyn Monroe fan from a very little girl, and then when I read the quotes that she had, especially in relation to Ella Fitzgerald, I was like, wow, that's not the Marilyn Monroe that I've ever been
Mhm.
exposed to, right? So
Oh,
I cannot wait to read that and to have that conversation. You definitely have to come back.
I will gladly come back to talk about that because
Yeah.
Marilyn and Ella are very. I'm in love with Ella Fitzgerald,
Hmm.
just intensely in love with her life and um, the time period that we wrote about is 52, I think, to 62.
Hmm.
And Ella Fitzgerald was a young woman. And so many, and she was a young woman and she
Hmm.
did young womany things. Because so if you remember Ella in this time frame, you're thinking Memorex
Hmm.
commercials or something like that,
Right.
or those last days of her life. Yes, if you're a fan of fantastic jazz music, you have some
Hmm.
connection to her. But writing about her youth and researching that time of her life was very enjoyable. Very
Hmm.
enjoyable process. Again, me and my research love.
Well, before we get out of here, I appreciate you sharing. And I'm excited about this book. Do you have aspirations? Because I think with both of these projects, your first book and this one, there's so much. I think there's so much to the mental interpretation when you're reading something, right? But
Mhm.
I would really love to see both of them made into
No.
television or film, just because I feel like, this is my personal opinion, but when I watch something that derived from a book, right,
Yeah.
it there's just so much more substance to it. And it's probably because there's a writer works with a screenwriter, but I just wonder, is that something that you would love to see?
Well, I of course would love to see that. I think that I know that once this writer's strike, because I think it's still going on,
It's still going on, yeah.
once it ends, and some needed resolution is made to that situation,
Hmm.
uh, there are quite a few authors, Black female authors, Black male authors who have gone beyond option They
Mhm.
have producers, they have showrunners. They
Mhm.
are sitting there waiting for this
Right.
thing to end
Yeah.
so they can continue this process. I have more books coming, and it's always early. We had about 10 inquiries for Wild Women in the Blues.
Mm.
But I am, my agent and I are in conversation to start talking about getting our own um, film agent,
Mhm.
more aggressively involved in the film process, because
Mhm.
there's just there are more people out there. Gabriel Union is producing.
Mhm.
Of course, Viola Davis is producing.
Yeah.
The Obamas are producing, and that's just
So
the
many platforms where the content can live and can have an audience that, especially, and the audience that you already have as a writer translates really well to that. So I would just say I look forward to hearing that announcement from you as well.
I
Um,
look
I
forward to charity. Charity.
I lied though. My last question to you is, can you give me the importance? I know when I met you at Black Writers Weekend last year, my son was with me, and my
Yeah.
son is a writer, and he always talks to me about literacy being a form of currency, because he feels like it is how we're able to pass down value from our culture to, and that's it's so important. So I would love to hear your opinion on why specifically biographical fiction is
Okay.
important, and why why more projects like yours and more authors that are focused on this particular type of fiction. We need to see these projects come to light.
We do need to see these projects, and the reason it's important is, once again, history. Just like a young person today doesn't know how to dial a phone. There's just so much information. I mean, the information that I have become more aware of in my adult days, um, in terms of Black history,
Hmm.
makes me mad.
Right, right,
Which is odd.
right,
I'm sitting here writing and learning and all this, and I'm like, well, why didn't I hear about this before? Why
right.
am I starting from, you
Yeah.
know, square 10
Hmm.
instead of square 100?
Hmm.
Um, what was the connection between Nigeria and the Caribbean and African and the southern coast of America, and what was happening? I was teasing a friend of mine, an author friend, and I said, where's that 14th century, 15th century book on African kingdoms and African kings? And then we posted, well, when we finish writing, it's just
Gotta
like,
get on that one. Get on that one.
let's go. Um, that's what's important. And I'll add one other thing. I am going to add something that someone else said. I believe Dr. Black was on our panel, and I don't have his first name in front of me or the name of his book, which is bad. But he said something very impactful during the session we had. He said that we read to our children when they're
Mhm.
little children. We should never stop reading to each other.
Mm.
um, as we grow older, as we are 17-year-olds, 27-year-olds, 45-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds, keep reading to each other. Take and
Mhm.
those wonderful minutes of sharing, watching the baseball game together. Oh, baseball, never. Basketball game together, or whatever.
Sure.
Pull out a book and share that with family, and
Mhm.
hey, let's read this. I have something I want to read to you. um,
Mhm.
Always have those words, and that, as you say, literacy in the family. That's where it can blossom from,
Yeah.
is from the home.
I agree. I agree. Well, please let our viewers know where, when, and where. Of course, they can pre-order The Other Princess, but where they can find the book, and of course, your first book, Wild Women in the
Well,
Beauty.
actually, I'm gonna see that one back there. In the Face of the Sun is my second book. Uh,
Okay.
yeah, so this is my third book. The Other
Third
Princess is actually my third book. But Denny S. Bryce, altogether That's my website address, dennysbryce.com, my Twitter handle, my Instagram handle. That's where you can find me on TikTok. I think I have author on the end of it. And I'm social media and me are friends, Facebook. And from there, you'll learn about where you can pre-order this book everywhere. It's Target. I mean, of course, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, indie bookstores. Please support indie bookstores, just wherever. So go do that. It helps. It helps. We want to spread the love for all of our authors.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Denny, for joining us and for sharing this. I cannot wait to get my copy and to buy some copies for friends of The Other Princess, and definitely looking forward to hopefully seeing you again at Black Writers Weekend and perhaps Essence, but definitely looking forward to hearing more about this Ella Fitzgerald, Marilyn Monroe.
Yes.
I cannot wait for that. So thank you so much. Please enjoy the rest of your week and enjoy Savannah, Georgia out there. It's such a beautiful
and the heat.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Well, thank you all for hanging out with us today. I hope you enjoyed hearing more about Denny's new book, The Other Princess. Make sure that you go ahead and pre-order that. You guys know how important that is for authors, so that people see there is a demand for that. I love what she said about indie bookstores. As you all know, we have a bookstore available through Rolling Out, Black Bookstore. So make sure you go to Black Bookstore and pre-order The Other Princess. This has been Sisters with Superpowers, author to author chat. My name is Crystal Jordan, and I'll be back next month with another author and more conversation right here on Rolling Out.